for that, and you should hear about that more information very soon, but we will get that to you when we can. So we'll save the date, November 2nd and 3rd of this fall. Apologies for the sirens in downtown Boise. Anyway, so our presentation today, we have Kimberly Davis. She's a PhD. She's a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And Marcus Robles, he's lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and he works out of the Arizona field office. They're going to be talking to you today about wildfire trends, forest regeneration, and intervention. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to them. We will be monitoring questions, comments in the chat, and then Matthew Ward will jump in at the end of the presentations and moderate a Q&A. He'll be just reading those questions out of the chat, so we won't open up all the mics at the end. But Kim, Marcus, take it away.
Great. Unless Marcos has anything to add, I'll start. Okay, got the thumbs up. Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a project that I worked on when I was actually a research scientist for the University of Montana. I recently just started at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab with the Forest Service. So this is a project that I was working on over the past couple years with Marcos and many other collaborators. So you'll see at the bottom here, there's a list of, there's 63 collaborators on this project. So this is a big collaborative effort. And what I'm presenting is shared work from this whole group. And so I think all of us are aware that we're starting to see more area burned by wildfires in the Western U.S. And so this is showing a figure that's the increase in area burned in the Western U.S. from the 1980s, when we started to have good satellite imagery and records of fires, through to only 2017. And so this is a trend that is continuing with really large fire years again in 2020 and 2021. And in fact, the median annual area burned has quadrupled in the 2 decades before 2000 compared to the 2 decades after 2000. And that's not even including 2020 and 2021. So we're really starting to see an increase in area burning across the West. And this is both due to larger fires and more fires. And we know that key drivers of this are changes in climate that are leading our fuels to dry out and be more just higher aridity of our climate, and more extreme fire weather and really dry fuels are leading to more area burning. But we're also starting to see changes in how areas are burning. And we are seeing increases in the area burning at high severity. And this is an effect of both changes to fire weather as well as changes to fuels, which are due to, past forest management, fire suppression, and suppression of indigenous burning. And so we're starting to see trends where we're having more area burning at high severity, both just because more area is burning, and also because in some areas we're seeing a higher proportion of the area that burning at high severity than we have historically. So what managers are now faced with are more landscapes that look like this, where we have a high severity fire, and we're not sure whether or not trees might come back into this landscape. So this is an example from the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana, but really close to the border with Idaho. And this was a site that was dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. And this photo is taken 17 years after the wildfire. And so we're really not seeing much tree regeneration on this landscape. And in fact, I just went back out to this site, and now it's been 23 years since the fire, and it still looks like this. And so over the past 20 years, there's been a lot of research kind of looking into what are the drivers of whether or not we see trees coming back after wildfire. And really, we've identified a couple key mechanisms or key drivers that determine whether or not we see abundant forest recovery in conifer-dominated forests. And so the first most important driver is seed availability. And this is because most of our species, with the exception of lodgepole pine, depend on seeds dispersing into our burn landscapes from trees that survived the fire. So when you have areas like this where we don't have a lot of living trees left to provide seeds, we definitely have less regeneration. So the distance to the nearest forest edge or mature tree that has seeds is a really important driver of regeneration. The other key factor that's been determined in whether or not we have post-fire regeneration is climate. And so we all know that climate is a really important driver of where we see certain species occurring. So for example, this is a hypothetical species. We might see it occupies this blue space with certain precipitation and temperature conditions. However, what we also know is that seedlings tend to occupy a smaller climate space than adults, and this is because they have short roots. They can't get down into deeper soil water that adults can, and they don't have bark when they're really small, newly germinated, and so really high temperatures right near the ground surface can girdle seedlings and prevent and actually kill them. And so we can have areas, because trees are really long-lived on our landscape, where the conditions when that tree is established, a couple hundred years ago were different, and now it's warmer and drier, and these adults, maybe they can hang out in those areas and persist where it's warmer and drier. But if a high severity fire kills those trees, we wouldn't necessarily expect regeneration because climate has shifted away where it's a little bit too hot and too dry for trees to regenerate. And so we're starting to see this, and there's been some work looking at kind of the driest edges of our forests and highlighting areas where this might be occurring. But really, we didn't have a good idea of what that picture looked like across the Hall West. And so the idea for this project was to get together a big group of researchers who have collected a lot of data and see if we could look at the patterns across the entire West to help us better understand the impact and relative influence of changes in climate and fire severity on post-fire conifer regeneration. So we know we have these two important drivers, seed availability and climate, but what's kind of their relative importance? And then second, can we better predict where and when climate conditions will really start to limit climate or post-fire conifer regeneration? Is it just at our very lowest edges of our forest, or are there other areas where we can expect climate to be more of a limiting factor? And so to do this, we got together a great big group of collaborators, as I said, and we combined had over 10,000 field plots where people had gone out into the field between 2 and 30 years after a wildfire, and collected data on the number of trees of different species that were present there following the wildfire regenerating. So we took all this data and we put it together, and you can see that this covers, much of the conifer forests in the Western U.S. We didn't have a lot of sites in kind of northern Idaho. I think those wetter areas hadn't burned as much recently as some of the areas on the, the Payette and the Boise National Forests. And then we didn't have any coverage of the wet Cascades forest, so we excluded those from our analysis. But altogether, we modeled post-fire conifer regeneration for 8 species combined, with one model just saying, what's the likelihood of having any of those species after fire? And then we also made individual models for each of the species listed here, with a couple combined because they're hard to tell apart as seedlings where they hybridize. And what we found was that, similar to kind of smaller scale studies, one of the main drivers of whether or not we see post-fire tree regeneration is distance to seed source. And so here I'm showing a figure from our model, which shows the probability of post-fire regeneration as a function of distance to seed source. So once we get, farther than a couple hundred meters from a seed source, the likelihood of regeneration is significantly lower. And you can see that on this photo from the Boise National Forest, where in the distance you can see kind of near the forest edge, we have some trees reestablishing. This was a fire in 1994, and this was about 20 years later. But out here where we're farther away from the seed source, we don't really have any regeneration. We also found strong evidence that warm and dry climate conditions limit post-fire regeneration. And we looked at climate both in terms of average site climate conditions, so looking at the 30-year mean water deficit of a site, so basically how drought stressed is this site on average. And that's what we're showing in these different color lines. So we can see our wet sites always have higher post-fire regeneration probability than our kind of average sites or our drier sites, which are shown in this yellow line. But we also looked at what was the climate like, what were the conditions like in the first 5 years following fire. So did we have a really hot and dry year right after the fire, and how did that impact regeneration? And what we saw was that if we have just one hot, dry year after fire, we see this big decline in the likelihood of post-fire regeneration. But there was an interesting interaction where at some of our wetter sites, we didn't really see an effect of post-fire climate. Those sites are kind of buffered from this interannual variability because they're wet enough overall. But at our kind of average sites and our driest sites, we saw this strong decline in the likelihood of forest tree regeneration if we had one hot, dry year following the wildfire. We also saw an interesting interaction between that post-fire climate, the hot, dry years after fire, and fire severity. So here I'm showing fire severity that was measured with satellite metrics, the relativized burn ratio, basically comparing satellite imagery before and after the fire. And so at our sites that burned at low severity, I should say, actually, this is for Douglas fir regeneration specifically, but we saw a similar pattern for most of our species. But this pattern was strongest for Douglas fir and other firs, kind of the more shade tolerant species, where what we saw is if the area burned at low severity, there wasn't really effect of this post-fire climate. But if it burned at high severity, we did see that if we had a hot, dry year after fire, there was a decline in post-fire regeneration. And so we think this is because fire severity can influence microclimate. And so we've actually done some other work in the fire ecology lab at University of Montana. A grad student there, Kira Wolf, showed that in areas that burn at high severity, the temperature is on average almost 4 degrees Celsius warmer than in areas that have some canopy left that burned at low severity or were unburned. And so this is suggesting that these areas that are really burned at high severity can be really hot and dry. And so then if you add on top of that a hot, dry year after fire, that's going to have a significant effect on the ability of the tree's seedlings to survive. However, if we have a low severity fire, then we have some canopy cover around that can help buffer those microclimate conditions, create a cooler environment in the understory, so the seedlings, especially of shade tolerant species or relatively shade tolerant species, were more likely to survive. So once we have these models developed of the likelihood of post-fire regeneration, we were interested in looking, spatially, what does this look like, and also over different time periods. What are we seeing in terms of changes from the 1980s through to future climate scenarios? And also to compare the relative changes over time to the relative changes between a low and a high severity fire scenario. So what we did was we took our models and we used climate from 3 different time periods, as well as 2 different fire severity scenarios. We put them through the model and made projections across space. For climate, for the future, we're looking at the years 2031 to 2050. We use 2 different emissions pathways, so kind of like a middle of the road future projections and a more extreme future projections. And I'll show you the results for 5 different global climate models averaged. For the fire severity scenarios, we incorporated a few different metrics. So distance to seed source, satellite drive fire severity, as well as tree cover on the landscape. So our low severity scenario is representing a landscape where there's still fairly abundant tree cover, there's seed sources right nearby, and it burned at relatively low severity. Our high severity scenario is representing a situation where the closest seed source is 150 meters away. So pretty far from a seed source, and there's still only 10% tree cover remaining and about 300 meters around the plot. So low tree cover on the landscape, burned at high severity, not a lot of seeds around. And what we saw here, I'm showing the results for the all species models combined. So there's some variability between species, but these are the projections for all species combined, moving from the 1980s and 90s on the left through to the future scenarios on the right. And this is the high severity scenario. On the bottom, these bars are showing what proportion of the landscape falls in each one of these categories. With the warmer colors representing areas we don't really expect there to be too much regeneration, and the cooler areas representing places where we do think there will continue to be regeneration. And you can see that there's significant changes over time And in particular, between the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, we've already seen significant shifts where we see a lot more red and orange across the West, and even here in kind of the southern parts of Idaho. As we move through time, the red colors kind of move up into the interior Northwest. We start to see some of the drier parts of the interior Northwest really see a decline in the likelihood of regeneration. But what we also saw was that when we look at the difference between the high severity scenario and the low severity scenario, there's even a bigger difference than the difference that we observe moving through time due to changes in climate. And so you'll notice if you move, from the top row to the bottom row, from the high severity to the low severity, that there's a pretty significant change in the colors on that map. And so this is really good news because in the immediate short term, there's not a lot that individual managers can do about global climate change, but there is something that we can do on the ground about fire severity, especially in our drier mixed conifer forests that historically burn frequently. There's a lot of evidence that fuel reduction treatments are really effective at reducing fire severity. So if we're able to shift from this high severity scenario to this low severity scenario, that will really increase the likelihood of forests regenerating after fire. And I also just want to point out that this climate data was at 4-kilometer resolution. So it's not the highest resolution climate data. It's some of the highest resolution that we have future projections for, which is why we use it. But within any of these kind of really red areas on the landscape, especially in the Southwest, there might be microclimates due to topography or vegetation cover that could actually support regeneration, even if they're showing up, as red due to kind of the macro scale climate conditions on this map. So we are really interested in the difference between the two severity scenarios. And so this is just another way to look at that. Here, what we're showing is the areas in blue are areas where we expect there to be regeneration regardless of fire severity scenario. The areas in orange are those areas that climatically are probably just not very suitable for these species anymore, because we didn't project that there would be regeneration even under the low severity scenario with abundant seed sources nearby. However, all of those yellow areas are areas where we expect there to be regeneration under the low severity, but not the high severity scenario. So these are areas where we think that any kind of management that we can do to reduce fire severity would really have a big impact on the likelihood of post-fire tree regeneration. And so, as I mentioned, those were the results for our all species model. So I also wanted to give you some examples of the differences between different species and also kind of zoom into Idaho. So this is Idaho. You can see outlines here. Here's, the Bitterroot in Montana. And this are the projections under the kind of moderate emissions pathway. So kind of middle of the road future climate projections from 2031 to 2050. In the top row, I'll show the low severity scenario. In the bottom row, I'll show the high severity. So for ponderosa pine, you can really see that except for in some of the driest areas, not, really close to Boise or some of the drier areas that we have here in Montana near Helena, we might see some reduction in ponderosa regeneration, but overall ponderosa under low severity scenarios is still pretty likely to regenerate in our part of the country. However, we see a big difference between the low and the high severity scenario, due largely to the availability of seeds. We see really similar patterns for Douglas fir, where in some of our drier parts of our forests where Douglas fir is, we might see kind of limited regeneration just at the lower elevation bands. But we still expect, pretty abundant regeneration in much of Idaho for Douglas fir if the area burns at low severity. If we see high severity, there's a much lower likelihood of regeneration, especially in the hottest and the driest forests in Idaho. And this is due both to the limitations of seed availability, as well as to those differences in the microclimate conditions. So Douglas fir in particular was one species where the impact of a hot, dry year after fire was really pronounced in high severity areas. And so you can see that with some of these really red areas in the hottest and driest places in Idaho. On the other hand, for lodgepole pine, we predict continued fairly successful regeneration. And here this really highlights the importance of species traits. So lodgepole pine is a serotinous species in many places throughout the Rocky Mountains, where the seeds store up in the canopy over time, and then when a fire occurs, the cones open and release a lot of seeds. And that's why we don't see this such a pronounced effect of fire severity, because lodgepole can still do really well after a high severity fire because it has that seed source available. And so for the most part, lodgepole seems to still be doing pretty well under our future projections. And then finally, subalpine fir has a little bit of a different pattern than we would expect, because historically subalpine forests have burned at high severity, and these forests do recover naturally over time. But surprisingly, we found that under the high severity scenario, we didn't expect to see as abundant regeneration of subalpine fir as under the low severity scenario. And I think what this really reflects is the importance of seed source and also time since fire. So these are projections for 10 years after a fire. And we know that historically subalpine forests burn more in the order of 100 or more years between fires. And so that gave the forest a lot of time to recover. And subalpine fir in particular is one of the species that tends to take more time to recover after fire. It's shade tolerant. And so even under, past or historic conditions, we wouldn't necessarily expect that it would be fully recovered, within 10 years after a fire. And so I think that's kind of what's going on here. But it also really highlights that, if we start to see increasing fire frequency in our subalpine forest, that could change the recovery pathways and the likelihood of these forests recovering if they reburn before the forests really have enough time to recover. And so I just want to say, if anybody's interested in these species-specific projections and jumping through different fire severity or climate scenarios, you can access these at this website or through the publication associated with the study. There's a link to this website where you can kind of move around on the map and change the different species and severity and climate scenarios. So overall, this study really highlighted that drier and hotter conditions are directly and indirectly reducing the likelihood of post-fire regeneration. So directly, just by creating those hot and dry conditions after a fire, and indirectly through their influence on fire severity changes. But we also found that changes to fire regimes that have increased the likelihood of high severity fire may actually be playing a larger role driving the reductions that people have started to observe in post-fire conifer regeneration than the direct climate impacts alone. So really the seed availability piece is really crucial, and really large high severity patches are definitely contributing to this decline that people have started to observe in post-fire tree regeneration across the West. And so I think two key management implications come out of the study. The first is that we really should expect and plan for a limited natural regeneration following high severity fire in many areas of the West. So even in Idaho, where we know that we have more moderate climate than in many parts of the West, if we have these really large high severity patches and we want forests to recover afterwards, we may need to be pretty active in our management, like go in and plant, because if we don't have that seed source nearby, there won't be regeneration of many of the species, with the exception of probably lodgepole pine. And so thinking about that before the fire, do we have enough seed stock? Do we have enough nursery capacity? Do we have the species that we want to plant after fire? And maybe even thinking about, what areas would we plant? What areas maybe wouldn't we plant because we don't think that they would be suitable climatically, in the future for forests. So then when the fire hits, we're ready to manage. And then the second key point is that anything that we can do to help reduce fire severity, for example, through ecological forest management, which I know is something that all of you work really hard at, this is really helping to offset some of the regeneration declines that we predicted due to climate change, especially in our drier forest types that historically burned more frequently. And I just want to thank the Nature Conservancy for funding the majority of this project. We got additional funding from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And again, many thanks to the many collaborators on this project who all contributed not just data, but also their time and expertise. And so now I think, Marcos, are we going to do questions now or jump right into yours and then do questions after?
Yeah, I think that's a question for Michael and Matthew, but it might flow better if I talk about the companion study first before questions, but looking at Michael for guidance.
Yeah, why don't you jump right into yours, Marcos, and we'll we have not seen any questions in the chat. yet, but I'm sure folks are processing this information. So please, if you do have a question for our presenters, enter that into the chat and we'll move on to Marcos.
Great, and just want to see a thumbs up if you can see my full screen of the presentation. Cool. Thank you so much for inviting us to your collaborative. We're super excited to share this work. Kim and I have been collaborating for a couple of years on a couple of studies. And so what I'm going to talk about is a companion study, because we weren't only super interested about what is the fate of forests in terms of recovery after wildfires, but just the larger question, what is the fate of forest carbon under climate change and high severity wildfires? So the study that I'm going to talk about is a study that we just presented for publication, or we just submitted for publication. And this is the title. It's Identifying Opportunity Hotspots for Reducing the Risk of Wildfire-Caused Carbon Loss in Western U.S. conifer forests. So it's the same scope that of the study that Kim spoke about, and we actually incorporated her study in a significant way in this analysis. I want to acknowledge Dr. Jamie Pillar, who's actually the lead author of this study, and most likely should be giving this talk. Just for scheduling challenges, we weren't able to make that happen, but I believe Dr. Pillar is on the call to answer any questions that I'm not able to answer. This was a real collaborative effort between the Nature Conservancy, the University of Montana, where Jamie has a joint appointment at the University of Montana, and the Nature Conservancy, and also with some funding from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. So the basic question that we wanted to ask with this analysis seems like a relatively simple question, but it has a couple components, and that is, where could we prioritize proactive forest management to reduce the greatest risk of wildfire-caused carbon loss? So by proactive forest management, what we're talking about here is ecological thinning or ecological burning, or combination thereof in forests where those tools are appropriate. And so we applied or adapted a vulnerability framework from the IPCC. And we like this quote to kind of center ourselves on what vulnerability means. And so what this says is, in order to effectively manage risk, it is essential to understand how vulnerability is generated, how it increases, and how it builds up. Kind of gives a sense that there's multiple dimensions to vulnerability, and how we expressed it, this in our analysis of forest carbon vulnerability is in three components or three factors. We looked at carbon exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Sometimes visuals are easier to share than a formula. So what we mean by these three components is, we first ask the question, where is carbon most exposed and sensitive to wildfire? And I'll explain exactly how we define those in a moment. But if you imagine a teeter-totter, forests might be more vulnerable if they have both high sensitivity and high exposure. If the carbon has high sensitivity and high exposure to climate change and wildfires. On the other hand, we ask the question, where might social adaptive capacity for proactive forest treatments reduce the risk of wildfire-caused carbon loss? So in that case, we might be able to tip the teeter-totter and make forests less vulnerable and more resilient to climate change and wildfires through the proactive use of these tools where appropriate. So here is a slide that gives you a summary of the different data sets that we use to evaluate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We use best available data sets across the Western U.S. Landscape. Many of them came from the U.S. Forest Service. And so for exposure, what we're comparing and contrasting is total carbon versus burn probability coming from fire simulation models. So where's a combination of, for example, high total carbon and high burn probabilities. For sensitivity, rather than kind of carbon stocks, what we are really looking at is a sense of flows of carbon, fluxes of carbon into and out of the forest, with a specific and special emphasis on wildfire fluxes. So we looked at data on potential wildfire emissions and something that we call committed carbon, because we know that after wildfires, there's a lot of dead carbon that is still left on the landscape, and that carbon is slowly emitted back into the atmosphere years and decades after the wildfire. So we looked at decomposition after wildfires. We also then looked at the other side, fluxes back into the forest system, and we used specifically the study that Kim just presented on regeneration probability and looking at those different climate scenarios as well as the different wildfire scenarios. And we also use the site productivity index to get a relative sense of the differences in growth across these forests in the West. For adaptive capacity, what we were looking at is sort of a first order approximation of where's the application of these tools kind of feasible. So we looked at forest type and fire regime and fuel models to understand, where these ecological burning and thinning are most appropriately applied to that subset of forest types and fire regimes where appropriate. We looked at an estimate of fire relative stand density to get a sense of if ecological treatments were needed, and if so, which type of treatment would be most appropriate. We looked at previous wildfire severities using the MTVS data set, I believe, to get a sense of where wildfires had recently burned and maybe where treatments weren't necessarily needed. And then we looked at land ownership, because as we all know, these tools are not allowed in specific areas, including wilderness areas. And then finally, we did a geographic analysis of distance to roads and perennial streams so that we could, evaluate just at a very, very coarse scale where these treatments might be feasible. Closer distance to roads and avoiding kind of perennial streams and wetlands. So with that as a background, I'm going to break down the exposure and sensitivity indices just a little bit more, because we decided to go with what we call composite indicators, because really with this framework, we wanted to compare a lot of different data sets and wanted to do it in a standardized fashion. So this is kind of a conceptual figure, and I'll show the data in the next slide. So for example, when we were looking at exposure, we had a couple of indicators that have their raw values have perhaps different distributions. And so we wanted, in the bottom row, we wanted to standardize those distributions. So they had the same kind of tercile breakdown, lower third, middle third, and upper third. We did that using a min-max normalization procedure. And then we were then able to combine indicators A and B to create a composite indicator that again preserved that the relative differences across the unique indicators. This is the actual data that we put together for exposure in the top row. So we looked at normalized version of burn probability on the left, total carbon in the middle, and brought those both together to get a sense of exposure, the lower third, middle third, and upper third. And then in the lower row, we are looking at the data that we used for getting a sense of sensitivity. Again, it's a relative sense of fluxes into and out of the systems. So we looked at potential carbon loss to emissions and decomposition. That's in the lower left. We looked at the low, moderate, and high probabilities of regeneration from Kim's study in the middle. And on the right, we looked at site index to get a sense of relative productivity and growth across these forests. Mashed these all together, and then we were able to look in a bivariate way at across the entire West. If I can draw your attention to the key in the upper right. So we're calling the forests that have the most vulnerable carbon as those forests that have moderate to high exposure. So those would be places with moderate to high carbon stocks, as well as moderate to high probabilities of wildfire. And then also those forests with moderate to high sensitivity. So those would be places that on the balance of things, there's likely to be more losses of carbon from wildfires than recovery of carbon from wildfires. And also areas that just grow at a slower rate because of the climate in those forest areas. So this is a map of what first order approximation of vulnerability of carbon across Western U.S. forests, with the warm colors representing those most vulnerable landscapes that I just described. And then we broke it down by state just to give, just to have an easy kind of heuristic for folks to look at this. And what we found is that California, New Mexico, and Arizona contained the greatest area of most vulnerable carbon relative to their total forest areas. You can see those red areas pop out in those states. But if you look at Idaho, you know, our first order approximation is that maybe 30 or 40% of the forest in middle Idaho, which I believe is the Blue Mountains ecoregion, have moderate to high mobility. And then we wanted to scale this information for management and for managers, because we know that managers don't work at the pixel scale, and also that the data that we put together on this regional analysis is probably not appropriate for interpretation at the pixel scale. So what we did is we used the Fireshed spatial hierarchy, which the Forest Service has developed for planning purposes in the wildfire crisis strategy. We adopted this hierarchy to look at our results. And we used project areas, which are kind of the intermediate scale of the Fireshed spatial hierarchy. These are each about 10,000 hectares in size. We also use Firesheds, which are order of magnitude about 100,000 hectares in size. We first isolated the top 10% of project areas that had the greatest proportion of the most vulnerable carbon. So in a priority analysis, you have to prioritize, and that's the metric we use for that. And then we identified project areas with enough treatable forest area to reduce the wildfire hazard. Using those factors that I described before, places where ecological thinning and burning were appropriate, identifying project areas that had enough of that treatable forest to reduce wildfire hazard. And here's what those results look like, with the headline that there are actually widespread opportunities to use proactive forest management to reduce the greatest risk of wildfire-caused carbon loss. On the left, what we're looking at is the smaller polygons, or those project areas, and the gray polygons are the firesheds. And then we also scaled up those results to the fireshed scale in the map on the right. So if one project area had treatable forest, then we considered that the entire fireshed potentially proactive treatments could lead to reductions in wildfire-caused carbon loss. So that's the map on the right. And then we know that where we wanted to go with this framework, what I'm about to show is how proactive ecological forest treatments could reduce risks to carbon in human communities. But we know that this framework is generalizable enough that it could be applied to biodiversity values or municipal watersheds, places with traditional practices, and also wildlife habitat. So we know that we can think about all of these co-benefits potentially at the same time. But this is what we're able to put together for looking at both carbon protection and community protection as well. And what we found is that there's opportunities to use proactive forest management to simultaneously reduce the greatest wildfire risk to carbon in human communities. Let me walk you through these colors. So the blue areas are places, opportunity hotspots, where we found that proactive ecological treatments could reduce wildfire-caused carbon loss. These are at the fireshed scale. The gray areas are areas that the Forest Service and the Wildfire Crisis Strategy, in a separate analysis, found that treatments could be prioritized to protect human communities. And importantly, the yellow areas, the yellow firesheds, are areas that are the overlap between this study and that prior analysis, where potential treatments could be used to protect both carbon and human communities. So the main takeaways from this study are that there are actually widespread opportunities for using proactive forest management to simultaneously reduce the greatest wildfire risk to carbon and to human communities. And then secondly, because this framework and because this risk framework that we adapted is fairly generalizable, it could be used to identify areas where ecological forest management results in co-benefits to multiple values, those watershed values that I was showed prior, or the biodiversity values. And ideally, we would be able to look at this at the larger scale to identify, to help with the prioritization of the large scale amount of funding that's coming through with recent legislation passed by Congress. This was a real team effort. Again, I want to acknowledge Jamie Pillar as the lead author But there were many co-authors from the Forest Service, including Kim Davis and others, as well as Phil Higuera at the University of Montana and colleagues at the Nature Conservancy. And with that, I think I can stop sharing, and I think we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
So we don't have many questions in the chat. There is one. So those of you that maybe are more comfortable just coming off video and raising your hand and want to ask a question, I think we can go that route too. But I'll read off the one that I have here from Dennis. The 2 yellow priority areas in Marcos's presentation appear to align with Idaho's 2 priority landscapes. Is that true in the wildfire crisis strategy? I'd have to go back and look at the map, Dennis, to be sure, but it did look like there was overlap. Did anybody else, Ara or anybody else, did you recognize that?
Yeah, I mean, that's how the yellow ones were defined, as if they were overlapping with the wildfire crisis strategy priorities.
So what?
Or do you mean the ones that were already selected for funding? Because I think that's also true. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there were 2 rounds of identifying initial landscapes. So that Jamie comments that there's the most recent round. In those yellow areas, they already adopted the community risk reduction fire sheds, and the yellow areas are the overlap where we also found that there could be carbon risk reduction through this study. So there is the overlap there.
I don't see much else going on as far as questions, but I do have a question for Kim. Kim, going back to that slide in the Bitterroot, I think it was a 2000 fire that did not regenerate, and it's been 23 years. I'm just kind of curious, if we waited another 10 years, is there going to be anything to show, or is there going to be any trees coming back? Or is, when we look at reforestation opportunities, I mean, it seems like that's dry and hot and it was high severity, it's going to be hard to even plant seedlings in a landscape like that to try to recover the forest. Is that correct thinking, or is there room for replanting in some of those landscapes?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And the key is, and I think we can do this from this data, is to identify areas where like the climate is still suitable, but we don't have regeneration just because there's no seed source nearby. And in this landscape in particular, I definitely think the climate is limiting, because the Bitterroot National Forest has been out there and they've replanted actually multiple times. So when I was out there in 2017, I saw a bunch of seedlings that they had planted that had died. And then I was just out there last week and they had newly planted seedlings either last year, but maybe the year before. They looked pretty recent. And most of those were also dead, unfortunately. So I think that this site is really a challenging site because it's really dry and hot, and the soil conditions. Because on some of the north facing slopes in this drainage, there was some regeneration. And in some of the higher severity areas, there was like even some lodgepole. But I think that's overall, that's a good point, in that we need to think about, where it's just the seed source that's the main limiting factor and where the climate is the limiting factor. And I would also put a plug in for there's this tool called the Regen Mapper, which I'll put a link in the chat, that's been developed with some of this data by Zach Holden at Region 1 in the Forest Service. And you can select a fire that you're interested in, and it will give you like fire specific predictions of the probability of regeneration based on seed source and climate. And then it will also predict a layer just based on climate. So you can kind of identify the areas where, maybe we won't have natural regeneration, but the climate still looks okay. And so that tool is hopefully helpful in thinking about like where it makes sense to plant versus where maybe it doesn't make sense to try to plant.
Thank you. Dennis, I'm going to just have you come off mute and ask your question that you put in the chat.
Sure. I think this is probably for Kim. I think one of the difficulties collaborative groups have when they are helping to design a project is how much intervention is enough. So, for example, say you've got forest stands that in a fire regime condition class context are class 3. They're the furthest departed from historical regimes. Do you have any hints from the data that you reviewed on what level is sufficient in order to increase the probability of regeneration? So for example, again, if it's in class 3, is it sufficient to move it to 2? Or should the thinning actually be at a higher intensity to get it back as close as you can to historical conditions?
Well, I mean, the first answer is this data doesn't really get at that exactly how much we need to thin it, because that it's just one step removed. So this data, I could put in different fire severities and distance to seed source and see how that would affect it. But we also need to link in like what level of treatment has what effect on fire severity. And so I have been working on a meta-analysis looking at the effect of treatments on fire severity. And there is a lot of information out there that shows that treatments are really effective, especially, I mean, and you guys all know this because this is what you do, but you know, quantitatively, we can say that these types of treatments with thinning and prescribed fire, or thinning and pile burning, or even just prescribed fire, reduce fire severity about 55 to 60%. And so that would be enough, but there wasn't enough studies out there to really dive into like the actual prescription and how much thinning was needed. And so I think that that's something that like people who are working on the ground and know better exactly, you know, they might have a better idea of exactly what the prescriptions would need to be to really get that decrease in fire severity.
One of the reasons, well, what comes to mind, I think, is the prequel to IFRP's annual conference was back in 2010. And Steve Running gave an excellent presentation on climate effects on forests. And one of the things he focused on was moisture constraints and how important that is as a limiting factor. But the reason I mention it is he was on his own property, he was showing the results of thinning that he thought was adequate in order to move the stand to something that the limited moisture could support. And as he showed the photos, you could hear an audible gasp in the audience because people really thought it was extreme. And, you know, the point that he was making was, you know, well, you know, don't be hesitant here, that if you undershoot, you may not be having the desired effect that you want.
Yeah, and that's another good point, that the thinning also helps with the drought tolerance. And Marcos could also speak to that with some studies from Arizona. But I guess I just want to emphasize that this meta-analysis, this like review of all the papers that have been done on field treatments that I've done, the other main thing was that we found was that the surface fuels had to be treated. So in areas where there was just thinning, but they didn't treat the surface fuels, there was no consistent reduction in fire severity. Sure. Yeah, I mean, but the good news was that we found that pile burns were also really effective. So in places where it's not practical or just logistically unfeasible to be doing prescribed fire, just doing pile burns was still really helpful compared to not doing pile burns. But yeah, I can't speak to the actual density that you need to.
Okay, all right.
Maybe Marcos has more insight on that.
No, unfortunately, I don't. I think it's going to, you know, vary by the state and the forest type that you're working in, and kind of that expert knowledge on the ground and experience. Kim did mention we did a similar kind of West-wide analysis of drought mortality associated across In this case, I think it was just ponderosa pine. And what we found is there's a density dependence, and this was using FIA plots. So this is not surprising to foresters, but the plots that had the higher density stands were more likely to have ponderosa pine mortality than those that had lower densities. We weren't able to quantify that in terms that would be helpful for prescriptions in individual places, but we know that that density dependence is important in terms of the water availability and limited water availability as we go forward with climate change. So that's another factor that I think you just mentioned there that we found supporting evidence for in this study.
Thank you. And just the other comment, I thought of the images, two of them that were the most startling to me were the ones for a fir under a high severity fire, particularly when I consider that well, not so much in southern Idaho, but in northern Idaho, the Douglas fir is often selected as a species post-harvest because of its broad range and ability to survive. So anyway, just a footnote on your presentation that I thought that both of those were truly an eye-opener.
Yeah, I also felt that way when I looked at the Douglas fir, because being out in the field in a lot of burned areas, especially when I was at sites in Idaho and kind of the Northern Rockies, I saw a lot of Douglas fir. But also when I look at my maps, so that was for the future climate, there's a big shift between the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. And so in the 80s and 90s, that map under the high severity scenario was still pretty blue. And so I think that, yeah, we are maybe starting to see changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both.
Yeah.
Anything else? And
I was just going to mention that Robin threw something in the chat, as well as Kim through the Regen Mapper, and Jamie added something to Kim or Marcos's comment, for those of you that didn't catch that. But as far as questions go, Michael, that's as much as I've seen so far in the chat. So thanks, everyone.
yeah, thanks
Thanks,
everybody
Kim. Thanks, Marcos.
for tuning in. Thanks, Kim and Marcos. Again, mark your calendars for November 2nd and 3rd. We'll be teaming up with the Montana Forest Collaboration Network and hosting our annual meeting in Missoula at the Hilton Garden Inn. So hope to see some of you there, and hope you have a great day, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.